Hey, what's up guys? Moto is known, especially in Western markets, for its solid mid-range phones, and the iconic G series just came out with its 2019 lineup. This is the G7 Plus. What's new, and is it worth an upgrade from last year? Let's find out. I'm Will for GSM Arena, and this is our Moto G7 Plus review. The Moto G7 Plus has a build pretty typical for a phone these days. It's Gorilla Glass 3 on the front and back. The design hasn't changed a whole lot since last year's G6, featuring Moto's signature round camera bump. The back panel slightly curves into the frame, which is plastic here, not aluminum. But it all feels pretty solid, and looks nice and sleek. The G7 Plus's screen is a 6.2-inch IPS LCD, with a 1080p resolution and a 19:9 aspect ratio. It's the same panel that you'll find on the regular Moto G7. The screen features a dewdrop notch cut out at the top, which is a bit wider than some competitors. I personally didn't have a problem with it, but it's too bad that there's no option to mask the notch with a black bar. With a pixel density of 405 ppi, content on the screen looks decently sharp, and blacks are pretty deep for an LCD. Brightness is pretty good, up to around 470 nits. Unfortunately, due to its reflectiveness, the screen's sunlight legibility outdoors isn't excellent, but it's still okay. We weren't impressed by the color accuracy though. Whites tend toward bluish, no matter which of the color presets you choose in the display options. One new feature of this year's G7 Plus is the stereo speaker setup. Here it sounds great, really well balanced, with the bottom speaker only outputting just a bit more bass. And it's overall quite loud too. There's also a 3.5mm audio jack down at the bottom. With headphones plugged in, audio quality is awesome, one of the best phones we've tested, and there's support for FM radio too. And although there are 64 gigs of built-in storage, if you want to store more content on your phone, you can expand this through the dedicated microSD slot. Unlocking the Moto G7 Plus is simple, with the lightning-fast fingerprint reader located on the back. Or you can use Face Unlock, which works well. But since it uses just a selfie cam, don't expect the level of security you'd get with 3D facial scanning. The Moto G7 Plus doesn't come with an official IP rating, but it does have a water-repellent nano coating on its internals, so it should be able to take a splash or two, but better not take it for a swim. The G7 Plus's interface is basically stock Android 9 Pie, with just a few Moto customizations sprinkled in. Just a note that this isn't a part of the Android One program, so updates may not come as quickly or reliably as for, say, the Google Pixel. It is confirmed to get at least Android Q though. But that said, this is pretty much just stock Android. You will notice a few changes here and there, such as the battery indicator next to the circular clock. Swiping over to the left opens up the Discover tab, with the latest news and a quick search box. Besides an on-screen key, you can open up the app drawer by swiping up from the bottom. And swiping down anywhere on the home screen will bring down the notification shade, quite handy on a tall phone like this. If you want to use gestures entirely, you can turn on one-button nav. It works a bit differently from the Google Pill style. Swiping up opens recent apps. Swiping to the left takes you back, swiping to the right switches apps, and a single tap will bring you home. Holding down will turn on the voice assistant. And if you want to enable more interesting gestures for the G7 Plus, like karate chop for flashlight or twist for the camera, you can do that in the Moto Actions menu. Behind all of these features is a Qualcomm Snapdragon 636 chipset and 4 gigs of RAM. In benchmarks, performance is decent, a step up from last year's Snapdragon 630. Games run without much trouble, but if you're on the market for raw power, there are a few phones out there in this price range with more powerful chips. For battery, the G7 Plus has a 3000 mAh power pack, and battery life is actually pretty disappointing. It scored an endurance rating of only 59 hours in our proprietary tests, less than the 70 hours of last year's model, and really one of the lowest scores we've seen in a long time. The G7 Plus partly makes up for that though with its fast charging speed. It comes with a 27-watt turbo power charger, which also supports Power Delivery 3.0. With it, we were able to charge from 0 to 79% charge in 30 minutes. Incredible, especially for a mid-ranger. The Moto G7 Plus has a 16-megapixel main camera, with an f1.7 aperture and OIS, surprising to have on a mid-range phone. There's also a 5-megapixel sensor used for depth sensing in portrait mode. In daylight, there's plenty of detail and a pleasant amount of sharpness and contrast. Colors are pretty punchy, not exactly true to life, and we did notice some noise in the sky and the dark parts of the scene. Dynamic range isn't the widest here. and the exposure tends to make the scenes a bit darker, especially in the shadows. But the HDR does a great job of restoring the shadows without ruining the highlights. It does come out a bit softer, but it's barely noticeable. In portrait mode, there's a slider that lets you choose the strength of the blur effect. Shots have plenty of detail, and the edge detection is some of the best we've seen on a mid-range phone. At night, the Moto G7 Plus is pretty consistent. Colors stay punchy, and images are sharp. However, the dynamic range is again holding it back. When the scene is really dark, the software can crank up the ISO and keep the shutter speed low thanks to the OIS. The result is a pretty bright image without any noticeable noise. It's definitely one of the best night shooters we've seen in this price range. Selfies are taken with a 12-megapixel front-facing cam which has fixed focus, and they're nice as well, with a good amount of detail. The dynamic range is a little lacking though. Selfie portraits are not as precise as the main cam, but still decent. One neat feature is support for 4K video with the selfie cam at 30 FPS. A lot of phones don't even have this on the main camera. These look good, but just a note that these aren't stabilized, so not the best for vlogging. In comparison, 4K video at 30 FPS on the rear cam looks decent, and there is some electronic stabilization to smooth it out. There's no visible noise, but the dynamic range could be wider. So that's the Moto G7 Plus. Overall, it brings some nice features, some of them pretty rare for a mid-ranger. There's a solid and good-looking design, super fast charging, stereo speakers, a good camera with OIS, and stock Android. The trouble is, for the asking price of around €300, the competition is pretty tough, especially in the categories where the G7 struggles, which are its battery life and to a smaller extent its performance. There are a lot of phones which offer way more in these regards and for a lower price. But regardless, the G7 Plus still has a lot to offer, and thanks to its fast charging, I think a lot of people would still be happy with it, despite the lackluster battery life. So it earns a recommendation, especially if the price starts going down. Thanks for watching, guys. If you're interested in the full test findings from the Moto G7 Plus, or you just want to compare it to some other phones, you're welcome to stop by gsmarena.com. We'll leave a link down in the description below. See ya!